including emissions and climate data management. Sorry, excuse me. Carbon credits, social good, and fields like law and insurance. So challenges like sustainability take a diverse ecosystem coming together to build solutions. And at the ESG committee, we're uniting our collective creativity, experiences, and brain power to develop white papers like our blockchain sustainability roadmap, which we're going to be publishing this year, to support sustainable Canadian blockchain projects with governance and research, and to do our best to help Canada become a global leader in this rapidly growing area of the blockchain industry. So we're going to kick off the webinar with a roundtable that will also act as an introduction to each of our committee members. They're going to be sharing their own individual perspectives on the biggest sustainability challenges that they believe blockchain will help solve and why. And if you have any questions for our panelists, please just pop them in the chat. We do have time for questions at the end, and we're very excited to hear from you. So first, we're going to start with Damien Newman, who is the CEO and founder of Greenworks ESG. Damien, what is the biggest sustainability challenge that you think blockchain can solve and why? Okay, we are going to move on. I believe Damien might have had an issue joining the event, to Wayne Logan, another longtime director at the consortium, who is a partner and blockchain leader at Miller Thomson. Wayne, what is the biggest sustainability challenge that you think blockchain can solve?
Well, it's the technology that can help solve it, and what we have is a real need for technological solutions that will enable organizing people and resources around sustainable development and climate positive projects. So I think that the technology can go a very long ways, Alexis, with what we need to do to help solve this issue.
Great. So it's the coordination of people and organization of people, which is going to be one of the biggest challenges going forward. And we are seeing a lot of really innovative models like DAOs evolving to use blockchain as a platform for coordinating things like sustainability initiatives, which is fantastic. So thank you for that. We'll go next to Manvi Garg, who's the head of strategic partnerships at DClimate. Manvi, what is your biggest sustainability challenge with a blockchain solution?
Yeah, thank you, Alexis, and just great to be here. So in terms of the biggest challenge, I would say that, traditional systems so far, if you think about it and just kind of look at the facts around us, haven't really served us much in terms of the progress that has been made towards climate action and towards climate change, I would say over the last 10 to 15 years. And so personally, I think, climate action, and there have been a lot of silos. That's a big thing that I would stress, in terms of how action has been taken over the past few years towards, this big threat that we have globally. And so, climate action absolutely can't be solved through, silos, and it needs collective and interoperable action that enables effective partnerships and ecosystems. So that's the big challenge that I think traditional systems haven't been able to solve. And blockchain can absolutely help facilitate that, help us move towards that climate action and collective action. I think the newer generations are obviously demonstrating that for us through just real world action. But I think technology obviously plays a huge part in that, and blockchain absolutely enables that. Whether it's through transparency, whether it's through organizations and structures like you just mentioned, like a DAO, and just different elements of, what blockchain can enable. Blockchain definitely helps us move towards that climate collective action.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Damien, now we're going to go to you, your biggest sustainability challenge that blockchain might be able to solve.
Thanks, Alexis. And sorry I was a little late getting on. I'm clearly in holiday brain right now. So I thought what I'd do is just do a quick journey of the evolution of ESG reporting since I founded Greenworks ESG 4 years ago and launched our data management portal in 2022. What we've seen is that reports used to be all narrative storytelling with little to no data metrics. Then they moved into sprinkling a few bits of data into the reports, some attached to global ESG frameworks. And now what you see is almost all reports have full data tables at the back, representing about 10% of the total page count within a report, and usually about 2 to 3 global ESG reporting frameworks. So what you've seen is the report itself has grown by 133%, but the data metrics within the report have actually grown by 554%. This is also the difference between sustainability reporting and ESG reporting, as sustainability reporting has been around for about 40 years. ESG disclosures are the due diligence that investors use based on real, tangible, quantitative data within these reports. And so within that, the challenges is that we meet with two different types of people every day. One that's forced into ESG by their stakeholders and don't know anything about it, but their banks, their customers, insurance companies have forced this upon them, and sustainability managers that are well-versed in ESG, but 90% of those aren't getting the support of their full C-suite. And support is needed because the ESG train has left the building. The biggest money managers in the world believe that ESG reports will grow from the 10% of the total page count today. The data within the ESG reports will go from 10% to 50% of the report in the next 5 years. And it'll also then move to quarterly reporting tied into the financials. So that brings up a lot of concerns. Who are the companies responsible for the data and reporting? Who is asking for it? Who are the stakeholders? Where should data be stored? Where should it be shared? Where should companies focus? What data matters? What frameworks matter? What is my legal risk? When is it expected? When should I start? And how can I get it on time and on budget? The good news, though, you're probably doing it already, as good governance has been in most Canadian businesses for years. Now you just need a way to collect, organize, and manage it. So what we look at for best practices is know what your stakeholders want, have a centralized database that creates a single source of truth. Is your data mapped to real frameworks to create real credibility? Are you providing quality data? Can it hold up to a third-party audit? Can you satisfy rating agencies' requirements, which all public companies must deal with? And do you understand the legal risk to avoid lawsuits and ESG activism and greenwashing lawsuits? And this is why I founded Greenworks, for simplifying your journey and giving you better data in less time. And it's also why I'm excited to be part of the Canadian ESG Consortium, blockchain consortium, because it is going to take advancing technology to keep up with what's coming next, which is ESG in your supply chain, which we're already seeing.
So helping track and automate all of the various governance issues around things like ESG disclosures and reporting, which around the world are becoming increasingly strict and mandatory. And that's a really important point. Thank you, Damien. So on to Lutetia Miller, who is the CEO and founder of 9 Irons Solutions. Lutetia, what's the biggest obstacle to sustainability that you believe blockchain can solve?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for the introduction, Alexis and Damien, for really great points there on the reporting side. As Alexis said, my name is Lutetia Miller. I'm the president and CEO of 9 Irons. I am also a Cree Métis and a member of Papaschase First Nation. And so the challenge that I see is in this, we're navigating this ambiguity and nuance, pardon me, in this novel space of forestry, biodiversity, and nature-based assets, and kind of managing the complex relationships between government and stakeholders, such as First Nations. And that's where I see a really great fit for blockchain to help us sort out, provide clarity, provide trust and transparency. So similar to Damien, I'll take you on a bit of a journey. So in the past, stewards of natural resources had a choice. They could either produce and exploit for profit their natural resources, or they could preserve and enhance at a cost, even if that cost was simply the opportunity cost of not producing. So in this scenario, for vulnerable sectors or communities whose only revenue potential was their resource production, there really wasn't a choice. When poverty is the alternative, production becomes the de facto choice, and often to the point of exploitation. So the carbon economy has created a third option, a real choice. The carbon economy, through forestry and biodiversity credits, has provided a mechanism to generate sustainable recurring revenues through preservation, not production. So this ability to unlock that capital trapped within through enhancement and not exploitation. So when we look at this through the lens of Indigenous rights and title, which is absurdly still being contested in Canada after 345 straight losses on the side of Canada, or in other words, 345 wins on the side of First Nations and Indigenous groups, aka the resource rulers, as coined by Bill Gallagher. These biodiversity credits, forestry credits, and the capital potential locked therein represent yet another tool for the assertion of rights and title by First Nations, and as such, another tool for the assertion and preservation of sovereignty. So bringing it back to blockchain, we get into the meat of the issue. So the challenge is that the mobilization of this tremendous amount of capital through Indigenous-led stewardship of resources is dependent on those credits and those tokens and digital assets working as they should and being trusted on a global scale. This is not specific to Indigenous origin credits. It's the same for the entirety of the credit space. And again, this is where blockchain comes in. So I'll forewarn you of this groan-worthy pun, but I honestly feel that blockchain is really the missing link in the chain. So in order for the carbon economy to see its true potential materialized, it must be trusted. In order for it to be trusted, it must be transparent. So when we digitize these credits, turning them into digital assets or tokens, and we stop tracking on a spreadsheet and instead register them in an immutable way while illustrating visibility from provenance through the chains of possession to its end of life, then doubt falls away and predictability enters the space. That predictability is important because it adds solidity to what we know is a very volatile market. The carbon credit space, it is highly volatile, which is certainly a product of its novelty, wild predictions and baseless projections kind of coming out of everywhere. But I truly believe that the carbon economy is the nearest thing to a global gold standard that we've seen since gold. And so of these borderless gases and emissions, a ton is a ton is a ton, thus we create a standard. And so blockchain, in enhancing that trust, removing some of that volatility, it means recurring, predictable revenues that can be generated through preservation and through ecosystem protection.
Excellent, Letitia. I just loved all of that, especially this idea that we can shift to this, new type of economy that values preservation instead of exploitation, and do so from a foundation of trust and collaboration using blockchain. That's just excellent. So next we're going to go to Dan Rickard, who is the Chief Innovation Officer of Nature's Vault. And what is the big sustainability problem that you think blockchain can help solve?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. To sort of add to Letitia's point, where she said it's the missing link in the chain. We actually see blockchain as being the entire chain, and we have a slightly different approach because we have a project. So we're implementing a project. It started with a very simple mandate. In Indonesia, they burn 19 million tons a year of rice straw. It has no economic value. The farmers need to move it out of the field. They burn it. It releases a lot of CO2. So that was the problem statement. No problem. Well, that's easy to solve. We'll produce biochar. And if we produce biochar, we'll put the biochar back into the ground. And we can do all that. And then as the project develops, you realize the reporting requirements to show that you're doing it correctly. So not only do you have to collect the bio straw, the biomass, you have to know who you're collecting it from. There's a piece of data. Not only do you have to have the farmer from the field bring it to the facility, you have to create biochar. Very specific rules and regulations on how to produce biochar. You then have to prove that the biochar is going back into the ground. That's great. You then have to prove a year later that that field was not burned. And how do you do that? The technology exists. There are multiple ways to do every single one of those steps. The problem is what was lacking was the way to report that we did each one of those steps. It's not a single vendor, if you will. So if I look at what blockchain is able to do, we all understand accounting, some better than others. We understand GAAP. GAAP is very important. Our society has spent generations perfecting accounting standards. Well, imagine getting into something like biomass and something like carbon credits, of which, Microsoft is buying 10,000 tons at $500 a ton. The X Prize by Elon Musk is, I think, $100 million to solve some of these problems, right? So the money is there, but it's really hard to prove the impact. It's easy to say, here's what we think is going to happen, but how do you prove it? And if I can use another analogy, if you look at these solutions being aimed at improving the health of the planet, it's not instantaneous. It's going to take time. We can stop, let's say, 20 million tons a year of carbon being removed from the atmosphere, but how do we know the long-term impact of that? And how do we track that this project that we started 10 years ago is now starting to see a positive impact on the environment, because it's not instantaneous. So we need this data not only to prove what we're doing now, but to prove to future generations what projects actually had a real world impact. We thought it was going to be this. We diagnosed it, we did everything right, and it actually turns out it didn't have the impact. So, all right, let's know that data, let's understand that data, and move on to another solution. So we really see blockchain being that technology tool that, when applied correctly, is the verify in the statement, trust but verify.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. And there are so many amazing blockchain supply chain traceability projects out there, such as a major project launched by Walmart in the US a couple of years ago that tracked very high risk of contamination produce from the point of origin at the farm all the way to market, and took the time to trace these products in case of a recall down from weeks to just minutes. So there are all these existing models out there of how blockchain is used within supply chains for tracking and traceability and greater data visibility for analytics that translate directly to things like sustainability and emissions metrics. So thank you so much for that. Next, we're going to go to our ESG Committee's fantastic co-chair, Derek Wenich, who is the Senior Business Development Manager at Vantage Circle. Derek, what's your problem and why is blockchain a solution?
Yeah, thanks, Alexis. No, really, it just echoes what everybody else said. And it's really the lack of ESG data provenance, immutability, and transparency, ultimately creating those efficiencies and undermining sustainability progress. And really, I think, what blockchain is going to do is it's going to help build a unified approach, creating interoperable systems and relaying that into a value proposition that will empower stakeholders at multiple levels, drive impactful change, and ultimately creating a more sustainable future. And with that being essentially the problem and how blockchain can kind of help, with creating a path forward, I think it's really important to also start with the fundamental, behavioral science around creating an engaged ecosystem, allowing more stakeholders to see what's happening. Like Wayne Mandy, Letitia was talking about is really being able to have that transparency of the data, where is the value? Where is the ROI? And then being able to reward those people that are creating the value to not only their organizations, not only them as an individual, but also to society as a whole. I think that blockchain's, really going to help eliminate that greenwashing. Like I said, create inoperable workflows and streamline these complex systems. And finally, really, that instantaneous rewarding of progress.
Yeah, I really like that. And that's something that Derek, you and I have had so many conversations about, how you can take some of these more enterprise focused blockchain applications like smart contract traceability and connect them to public chains to be able to introduce things like reward mechanisms for behavioral changes that result in emission reductions.
That's right.
So it can be very powerful on a wide number of fronts, and I love those points. So next we're going to go to James Graham, who is the CEO of Guild One. James, what's your problem?
Well, I think the problem, and we've heard about it a lot on the call, and you've heard a lot of repetition of patterns, and a lot of that kind of circles the concept of measurable impact. And if we think about the impact that we're striving to have the purpose to actually address, I think the timing of the UN report yesterday is just another indication holding up this tent, but mobilizing. So the estimations of the amount of capital that would be required to take all of the reporting entities to a net zero future is about $100 trillion. For some scale there, the voluntary credit market is somewhere between 2 and 3 billion. So many, 5x iterations smaller. We have, how do we actually stimulate that sort of capital deployment towards these sustainability issues in the right projects to create this energy transition that's much vaunted, much discussed, and the sustainable infrastructure, but not really well understood at scale. And I think there's been a lot of motion in a lot of different vectors towards it. So how do we scale that unless we have a technology solution, as Wayne addressed, for proving and scaling the validation, for automation of these validation and proving the ESG data? And that's really the central tenet here, is prove it. We really can't trust the annual reports that were coming out, as Demian addressed. We really can't trust. We can, these companies have credibility, and now we have a lot of vendors opening up with new solutions that are driving trust into the situation. But how about a technology that won't require us to trust the counterparty, that will actually surface the right data? And that comes down to a concept of measurement, reporting, and validation. How are we going to measure these things? How are we going to share those measurements? How are we going to report on them? And importantly, how are we going to validate those measurements and those reports so that they can be shared and drive value into the vehicles we're talking about? Most of the companies already have a net zero strategy, but a lot of them are sort of, trying to play fast follower. The ones that are out in front have been taking a bit of a beating, a lot of them, on the veracity of the types of offsets and credits they've bought, and even the veracity or the efficiency or effectiveness of a credit market at large. So there's a lot to prove, and proving it is also showing that we need to Letitia's point, we need nature positivity, we need governance positivity, we need positivity towards sustainable systems outside of industrial, but we need industrial scale to actually get us to net zero. So we're looking at what I reckon is one of the largest team sports we've ever seen, outside of like the foundation of the internet and the sharing of those protocols. The standards that we're all talking about need to stretch over such a broad domain that this is the ultimate scale team sport. And blockchain gives us an ability to share assets, to actually have a token, but that's an object of data that we agree is a representation of a real thing. And in our case, a ton of carbon, or a tree, or a bison, these things that we can represent. Now there's technical challenges on what we do with that, but then the blockchain gives us a ledgering system under which we can move these things around. So if we have a trusted asset that represents a real thing, and we can move it around in a way that we don't have to trust each other, that's DLT, and we're sharing those calculations and those measurements and those reporting vehicles and those validations. And the key thing will be then, how do we automate all of this? And that's the secret of the smart contract. When you have a basis of fact and you have a basis of consensus, and you can automate it with smart contracts, you have the organizing principle of how these markets and domains will need to scale. So I believe, having played in this, I'm a recovering Bitcoin miner. I'm the first to admit there was a small AA on that, but I've since, really the firm's resources are going into how we can use these technologies to validate and replace trust with consensus and rebuild trust in those communities that are suffering with it. So I see a really strong value proposition and way forward for this technology.
Excellent. Really great points, James. And, just to follow up on what James mentioned about needing to mobilize this absolutely massive amount of capital to get close to achieving net zero by 2050, as most global governments are committing to. We have a situation where, according to Morgan Stanley, by about 2030, a third of all assets under management globally are predicted to be ESG assets. But there are immense greenwashing challenges that are causing investors, especially institutional investors, to lose trust in this market. Like just last year, Morningstar had to strip over $1 trillion in ESG assets from European markets because their sustainability claims were unfounded. So blockchain is going to be essential to building that trust to be able to mobilize this incredible amount of money we need for sustainable infrastructure, which really leads into you, Martin, from an insurance perspective, as the Senior VP of ESG transactions at Gallagher. What is the big problem that you see that blockchain is a technology that can help solve?
Well, thank you very much. And I think all the speakers and all the committee members here have really hit the nail on the head. It comes down to that denominator, which is data. And how can blockchain help us with giving transparency, trust, and integrity to the data that's collected around all these issues, whether they be additionality through technology or nature-based solutions. So this is where the insurance market and the banks and private equity and the money and capital all come from, and they're concerned. So the insurance industry needs to really improve the speed at which we collect reliable, quantifiable data to meet the demands of ESG transactional products that will ultimately backstop a lot of the development of green technology, green energy, through products that protect what everyone's been talking about here, whether carbon offsets and insurance products that also backstop project financing around renewable energy, performance technology, and the role of blockchain, which really insurance companies and banks have been struggling with over the last so many years. How can blockchain work? What's the business case for it? Well, I think it's being made by groups like, the Canadian Blockchain Consortium and this group to really put a framework around that and how banks, insurance companies can use that data that can be trusted, that brings with it integrity to what is really a highly volatile environment. We all know about the Guardian article that talked about Vera's offset credit data that was something like 90% invalid. So how do investors, capital markets, and insurance markets all working together to support all this whole value chain, this pathway to net zero that we're all on? And much of that will come down to the data. And as I said at the beginning, at the top, that's the denominator here. And this is where we have to understand where this all intersects. So I believe blockchain used appropriately can make the business case around trading of offset credits in a really transformative way that will move this everybody on the pathway. The insurance markets are paying huge claims out the back end, so they're very committed to working with clients and investors to build a more sustainable future. And it's very nascent. Everybody's trying to figure this out at the board level, down to the practical level. And as everyone said, I think blockchain could be a really important tool to move this along and move deal velocity along and bring some certainty and comfort to all the parties in this great experiment that we're conducting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the energy transition is, widely acknowledged to be the biggest economic shift that the world has ever seen. We're still only in the earlier stages of this, and it's incredibly complex and
Yes.
challenging to navigate with this additional urgency of that IPCC report that we need to mobilize, everything, everywhere, all at once. I mean, this is a very high pressured environment right now. And listening to all of you, it just strikes me that this is the right time for, new infrastructure, new types of economies, and to take, very brave leaps forward in innovation, at this time when so much depends on it. So thank you all. It was great to hear everyone's problem statement and why blockchain is a solution. And as I mentioned earlier, this is just our first webinar. We're going to be having a series of webinars this year where we're going to be drilling down into some of these challenges, things like addressing carbon markets and social equity and fairness, and other issues in a more specific way. So I hope everyone watching will join us for those as well. So I'd like to ask, we just finished this great dialogue from an insurance perspective and from James's perspective about mobilizing institutions and navigating this lack of trust in the market. So I want to ask, and I'll start with you, James. What are some examples that you can give of how blockchain can help markets navigate these enormous types of risks to be able to feel comfortable moving forward with supporting the energy transition and our push towards sustainability?
Well, I think, I finished off I think Martin's comments are very salient to that as well. So I would address a couple of the points that he said and combine them with mine. The automation potential of the smart contract is what replaces a lot of manual action. And manual action, we call it in the data management world, we call those fudge factories, right? Because people can take on a series of facts, they can do things independently on a spreadsheet, and they can republish those facts. And I use the term loosely because they're really interpretations of facts that get reinvested. And that's causing institutional friction because everybody has their own picture of things then. Everybody has cultured their own set of truths, their own set of facts. And when we see assets that span multiple custodies, like a fungible asset that would represent a ton of carbon, or in our hydrocarbon space, from the wellhead to a sales meter, how products move through these, every slice of custody has a different kind of perception on it. And commodity markets have worked this out over the years. But the thing is, they're not fully automated markets either. I think the unspoken truth of a lot of this stuff is there's a lot more Excel-based modeling and process management than people want to really admit to. We talk about digitization, but a lot of stuff is trapped in spreadsheets. In fact, I worked in an oil and gas company that had 80 line of business systems, but when they did source of truth, they had 1,800 spreadsheets that had parts of the truth. And when you look at that kind of fragmentation, institutions that need this sort of overarching, de-risked, salient narrative about what this thing is and what we're trading it for, and some finality around those transactions and data points, that kind of friction is really tentative. And when we have so many players and so many frameworks, and I think this is a real problem right now, is the amount of new frameworks and standards and certification bodies. A lot of those are going to become black boxes on the side of the road because we can't support all of those, and they're fragmenting us as well. So the institution looking at this is going, I'm well-intentioned, I'm well-purposed, but I'm looking at a sea of data sources, and a sea of certification bodies, standards, practices, and organizations. How are we going to thread that? So I think that's where the organizing principle is required for the institution.
Yeah,
I'd
absolutely.
just like that. I'd just like to add to James' point. Insurance companies and banks, these are, whether we like it or not, the big investors around this transition for much of the time. And we can just look at the lack of clarity around bank failures, recent bank failures, Silicon Valley, First Republic getting Credit Suisse. All these, there are so many different metrics, and we're looking at well-established banking regulators. And if we're talking about a new economy and the new framework, this is where transparency and integrity and trust around the data is so very important as we try to figure this out. And we have to approach it with this new view, because clearly the liquidity tests of the past are just not working anymore. So I know it's a big challenge, and it feels like we're actually boiling the ocean. Well, I guess that's a poor metaphor, but it just talks to the urgency of everything that we're discussing. So there you go, from an insurance perspective.
On that, Martin, just a quick aside, it took us, 60, 80, arguably 100 years to get accounting practices to a consensualized and global standard around IFRS. So how long? We don't have that time for this transaction. So we need to look at technological fundaments, foundations, and underpinnings so we can shrink that time frame.
What about, if I could jump in? There's several things that are the topic of the day. One's ESG, blockchain, but the other one's artificial intelligence. Everywhere you look, there's articles on AI. So James, you talk about all those databases having multitude of different truths. Can artificial intelligence have a role in what it inputs into the blockchain so that, that there's a truth? What about the role of artificial intelligence in all this? That's a question. I don't know the answer.
Well, I'll just address that and then I'll shut up. But you have to really break artificial intelligence down then. That's a lot of things under that umbrella, Wayne. And if you're talking about kind of data, there's just some core statistics and data sciences in what's called artificial intelligence, and they play a role every day. They play a role every day for how markets are made, how transactions are done. To your point, if you're talking about natural language processing and some of the stuff around ChatGPT, well, we're in an era of vast evolution there. But right now, I wouldn't say that any of those functions could go unguarded. You wouldn't want to automate one of these AIs without a lot of validation and verification. So as inputs or interpreters, they're definitely valuable. As final arbiters, I think we got a way to go. And of course, in the blockchain world, garbage in, garbage out. Like, we need to be able to take multiple consensus points. Can a machine learner or a natural language processor or one of those big statistical engines be part of that? 100%, but not at the expense of the validation pattern itself.
Wow, interesting. And I think we should do a webinar just on the confluence of blockchain, AI, and sustainability, because it's absolutely fascinating. And there's some really, really interesting work being done in that space. That also includes, things like decentralized AI, where blockchain can help provide more visibility into those black box processes and hopefully help build more trust in AI. So next, I'd like to talk about something which, I think we all here agree does not get enough attention, and that is the S in ESG, and our need to focus more on the social impacts of things like climate change. There are a lot of great initiatives going on around the world that support things like conservation, but oftentimes the needs of Indigenous stakeholders come secondary. So we need a more fulsome way to incorporate that S into sustainability projects. And I'd love to start with you, Lutetia. How can we create more equity and fairness in things like conservation using blockchain technology?
Yeah, great question. And I I will kind of, I'll take this definitely from the perspective of, or what I see as a perspective of Indigenous groups. So I think most of us intuitively recognize that Indigenous stewardship over our natural resources is the only true and effective stewardship. So a reliance on wise practices and traditional knowledge. We've given the government a chance to protect our nature systems. They have failed. We see that in unmitigated wildfire damage and the impact of pests. We've given industry a chance to protect our natural resources, and they have also failed. And we've seen that in overforestation, soil erosion, habitat desecration. And so what is unlocked, however, via the carbon economy, and I know there's a question in the question and answer box that I hope we can get to, is that is an active effort. So by unlocking capital that is inherent within these sequestration and these carbon mechanisms, that capital goes towards, you know, the jobs and the active management of some of essentially preservation efforts. So when we're creating jobs, we're creating health, we're creating welfare and wellness. And so through these ways and through engaging communities, that's where I think there's a great opportunity to address the S. And as you say, it is often overlooked.
Absolutely. And please feel free to address that question now, if you'd like to take a minute to do so. Yeah.
Absolutely, because I think what the question is in the chat box, I don't know if everyone can see it, but it says, how would a carbon economy come to fruition? So please provide insights on how we can incorporate this into our current economy. How does one get paid on the carbon economy? And I love that because it's tangible. It takes us out of the hypothetical into how does this translate into, you know, dollars in our pockets, which is so incredibly important. So the carbon economy gets mechanized through several different levers. So stewards over natural assets have the potential to sequester carbon, can quantify that sequestration potential, digitize it as credits, as tokens, and then market those to industrial buyers. What we have to keep in mind is that the basis of the carbon economy is what helps industry or enables industry to keep industrying. So that revenue generation can take on several forms. So it can be front-ended agreements that are made with industrial buyers who really want to lock in their offsets for the next 10 or 15 years. Many of those are willing to pay a higher price for tokens that include various components that meet their objectives and some of their external commitments. So that could be credits that represent jobs or preservation of sensitive plants or species, or that provide other social value that garner a premium from those buyers. Then there's also lagging credit programs where one would have to essentially grow out the carbon sequestration potential and then first and then find a buyer later. Or one can also register and trade on digital marketplaces where arguably the base, less nuanced credits might have a place. It's fairly straightforward and transactional, but there are certainly options and plenty of experts in the field to help us navigate those.
Wow, that was such a great answer, Letitia. And again, I feel like we need a webinar just on the potential social impact of things like the blockchain-enabled carbon economy, as well as other blockchain innovations on equity in climate finance and conservation, because that is just such an important topic. I'd like to next just jump over to Manvi, because Manvi, I know you have to drop off a little bit early, but I know that DClimate does some really interesting work around using blockchain for helping support better ESG performance in agriculture. Is that something that you can share a bit about with us in terms of how that works and what blockchain can do for agricultural projects?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Alexis. So there's a couple of different layers in terms of how DClimate operates. I would break it down into kind of the first layer, which is the open data marketplace that DClimate has. So that's kind of the fundamental layer of how, dClimate operates. So it's an open source data marketplace that, we work with kind of twofold in terms of the data sources. So one is partnering up with, experts such as, Gil1 and other partners that we have for data providers that are developing data sets, within, different types of climate perils. So that's one example of how we make that data available onto a marketplace. And then through that data, and then also there's other open sources like, NASA, NOAA, and so forth. And then, through those sort of sources and data sets that are available on the marketplace, the second step that comes in is enabling users who might be interested in accessing climate data for, whether it's analysis for a corporate report, whether it's a small farmer looking to access, data around soil or precipitation in a specific region. All of that data is made available in an open and transparent way on the marketplace. That's the first layer, how, data accessibility enables kind of that, feedback loop, I would say, in a way, for farmers to make more data-driven decisions. So that's the first step. The second step is, and I don't know if I mentioned this before on this webinar, but essentially dClimate is a decentralized climate tech company. And I think it kind of ties back to my problem statement, which is around, the problem of silos and how traditional systems haven't really been able to, make that much progress over the last, 10 to 15 years in terms of collective climate action. And so through a decentralized network, what dClimate is doing is not only enabling users to, get access to that data from a decentralized infrastructure, but then also enabling users to develop applications with us using that data. And so obviously we want, users within our ecosystem and clients to come to us, use that data to develop, different types of applications that address different types of climate issues. And dClimate is also doing that internally by developing products that, address and help, different types of stakeholders. And your question around agribusinesses. So one example of that is a, predictive weather analytics application that dClimate's developed that helps, farmers, agricultural businesses to understand how, weather impacts their harvesting cycles, their production cycles. And that's something really important, especially if, you're a farmer looking for insurance, let's say, and you want to be able to know how much, weather is going to impact my farm or my field, or whatever it is that the farmer is working on for the next 10, 15 years. That can really help drive, both from a farmer point of view and from an insurance point of view, decisions that are more data driven. And then that comes to my third piece, which is, dClimate, just as some background, was born as an IP out of a company called Arbol, which is a parametric insurance company. And it's really interesting how we've been talking about insurance and, banking and all these different stakeholders. And insurance is a huge part and a huge, I would say, sector that dClimate is able to work with, just given how we originated, our, team's background. And so Arbol, which is a parametric insurance company, uses dClimate's API and data to, make insurance payouts that are based on data triggers. So, traditional systems, again, where someone is going in physically and manually doing a checkup on, how much loss has been, how much loss occurred through a weather event or so forth, might not necessarily help in a situation that we are in today, given how, climate change is happening so quickly and fast. We don't have 10 to 15 years or even months, let's say, for an insurance company to go in and do those assessments. So we need quick data triggers, and that's where dClimate and smart contracts come in, where, dClimate's data can be used to trigger those payouts just based on smart contracts and automatic, information that's available on chain. So that's the third way in which, dClimate helps something focused on an agricultural way. But overall, and I just quickly wanted to add this, I really like the point that Wayne brought up around artificial intelligence. I think that's an really interesting and important way to come back to that problem statement of silos, right? Where blockchain is an amazing technology, as we all agree, obviously, on this, and we might be a little biased on this webinar, but I think it's important to note that one technology or one innovation can't really make that collective change. We need to be able to work together with, all sorts of resources that exist and, that we have access to. And artificial intelligence is one of them. I think blockchain paired with something like artificial intelligence, and I like James's point on, using that as an input right now, and then always having those validation steps to make sure that, the information that we have is actually accurate, really does help, because something like artificial intelligence can help accelerate some of the work that blockchain is doing. And I think that's where, things like carbon economy that we've been talking about can be really helpful, where, a tool, and I think Alexis, about this, we're working on a DMRB technology that is looking into carbon sequestration and so forth. And what that's using is both blockchain and artificial intelligence to monitor and measure, how carbon's being sequestered. And so I think, I just wanted to emphasize that, collective climate action is something that's not only applicable from a stakeholder point of view, but also from a technology point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. No, those are all really, really good points. And actually, later in April, the Canadian Blockchain Consortium is going to be publishing our blockchain convergence plan, which actually examines in detail some of those synergies between blockchain and technologies like IoT and AI, including how they apply to some of our climate data challenges. So really excited for that. It's going to be launched at the Alberta Technology Symposium, which is going to be held on April 26th and 27th. So I just want to remind everyone watching, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please just pop them in the chat. We'd really love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your ideas, any questions you have about any of the topics that we've covered so far here today. And next, I want to jump to Damien. Damien, I know that Greenworks has done some really interesting work around Indigenous equity in things like ESG disclosures. How do you see blockchain as an enabling technology for ensuring that companies are behaving in a socially fair and equitable way? And how can blockchain help, prove and trace that?
Well, I'll echo James's comments from earlier that data trapped in Excel spreadsheets isn't just the E data, it's the S and the G data as well. And we see this on a weekly basis, where it's not only trapped in Excel spreadsheets within the company, but they don't have no idea what spreadsheet and what computer and what person's attached to it. And the interesting piece of that is that the E, we always say the E is, in terms of public attention, the E is the size of a building, the S is the size of a car, and the G is, you need a microscope to see it when it comes to ESG public opinion. But in reality, that should actually be flipped around, because if you're managing the G, it'll take care of the S and the E. And but the reality is that also, when it comes to all the data metrics, if you took all the global frameworks and you combined all the data metrics, there's over 700 topics and categories. There's only 45 that are quantitative emission metrics. So that leaves a lot of other data that we have to deal with when you deal with ESG and the full scope of ESG. And the S side of it, Canadian companies have always been fantastic world leaders in this. But that comes back down to the trapped in an Excel spreadsheet. No matter how great you are at it, if you can't find it within your company and you can't prove it within your company, then what good is it if you don't have technology to manage it and to have a single source of truth and create that credibility within it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Great points.
I'd
Derek.
just like to quickly jump in, Alexis, and just add a point to Damien's. I think it's really great that blockchain is being used for ESG reporting. I don't know if anyone on this call is familiar with a organization called the HBAR Foundation. But I would just like to give a quick, I guess, high level on what they're doing. Is essentially they're using blockchain to make ESG reporting more transparent and more easily accessible for institutions and so forth. So yeah, I would highly recommend anyone looking into the use of tech for that to check that out.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. So Derek, you and I, as I mentioned earlier, have had all of these great conversations around how blockchain can be used to support things like incentives for shifting to climate-friendly behaviors. Are there any examples that you can give us of what that would look like in practice?
Yeah, you bet. James kind of mentioned some of this is that it's translating it to something of value. And once a piece of data is, tokenized and something of value, then that can be rewarded to an organization, a group, an individual, and then that can be redeemed for whatever they see fit for their specific use. So I think it's really that tokenization and really again the fundamentals of behavioral science around appreciation, incentivization, reinforcement of those behaviors, and then emotionally connecting those positive behaviors to continuously manifesting change.
Interesting. So one example, like just off the top of my head, could be if you could measure an individual's reduction in their own carbon emissions from, say, appliances in their house because they chose to make more climate-friendly decisions. They could earn, something like tokenized carbon credit rewards in exchange for changing their behaviors. Is that kind of what you're thinking of?
Yeah, that's great. Whether it's driving behaviors, not accelerating as fast, those little tiny behaviors can drive sustainable impact. Changing out your windows, and those are on an individual basis. But things like this. I just had a baby, and I just bought this toy from Amazon. What is the material? What is the carbon emission of this? And why did I choose to buy this? Because of its carbon emission? Because it was cheaper? So if I knew the data behind my individual buying decisions, or at a corporate level, from a procurement standpoint, if I knew the data and if I knew the information and the analytics, would it change my path? And if it changes my path, maybe I buy something different. Maybe you choose a different vendor or supplier to work with. And if you don't have that data, then you're never going to change your habits. You're never going to change the direction you're on right now.
That is such a good point, that we have such poor visibility into the actual emissions intensity and environmental impact of most of the things that we buy or use every day. So as individual consumers, we're starting at a point of very low information when it comes to being able to make their, better decisions or more values aligned decisions. So that kind of leads into my question for you, Dan. As you were talking about your rice straw biochar project in Indonesia, how do you see blockchain helping consumers of that biochar have full visibility and trust in the sustainability of that project? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Well, in practice, it can be problematic. And the reason I say that is, especially dealing in Indonesia, we're talking to farmers that have been doing things a certain way for thousands of years, right? So for us, we started with education. It's about explaining that, saying, look, we're not saying don't burn this in the field for any other reason than if you put biochar back into your field, you can get a higher crop yield. There is a potential for an environmental benefit. And quite frankly, it could be a financial benefit. If you make more rice and you sell more rice, you're going to bring in extra income. So that's at the farmer's level. That's done through education. However, we need to track everything from start to finish, taking it out of the field, putting it back into the ground, because it's not just the governments that are asking, right? One interesting thing about doing projects in Indonesia, they're not historically noticed or known for being the fastest government to deal with. And we expected that. However, to our surprise, this project got immediate adoption. And when we finally found out why, the gentleman who told us was a little surprised we were even asking. The island of Java has 2,600 people per square mile. To give you an example, Alberta has 15. When you talk about a decrease in rice production due to climate change, it's not an inconvenience. It's not a, oh my gosh, it's going to be a tough day. It's 150 million people on an island going, I'm not eating as much as I used to, and inflation is already hitting me, and why is it so expensive? And we have a couple questions, and that is problematic. So food security is not just a nice to have. For certain countries, it is a must have. So what we're finding is the government is saying, look, we're happy to engage with the partners. We're happy to do the right thing, but we don't have a lot of time to get it wrong. So we really need to make sure you're applying best practices. There's data to back it up. We can track what's working. We can quickly change things if it's not working. One thing, we talked a lot, and I took some notes. I really like the concept of source of truth. That's great. However, if we look at Silicon Valley Bank going under, all of their data was public. There was no lack of truth. We knew the truth. It just didn't work for the model. Well, what that's going to eventually change into is proof of impact. Do what you say you're going to do and ensure that that project fixes what needs to be fixed. That's a very bold statement. It's going to take a long time, but using the right technologies tied in with something like blockchain to prove that everything is coming together at least gives us the ability to monitor that data as timely as possible. And really, that's what it comes down to. We need to make changes quickly, but they have to be the right changes at the right time.
Which just underscores the enormous importance of the analytics component and that intersection between AI and blockchain, and why that's going to be so essential for being able to surface, actionable information about the efficacy of those types of projects. And thank you so much, Dan, for those fantastic points. Wayne, I know that Miller Thomson has developed a really good ESG law division. And I would love it if you could give us some examples of the kinds of legal considerations that companies face regarding things like ESG disclosures, or navigating the application of blockchain to sustainability projects like tokenization.
Well, good. Thanks, Alexis. The Miller Thomson Committee is focused in a large part on the financing aspects of the ESG, and the federal government has come in with regulations. So if you're a bank and or a borrower, better yet, and looking to borrow money from a bank or from a venture capitalist, you got to be showing how you're dealing with the ESG issues of your business, and otherwise you won't get your loan. So those are really good initiatives. Unfortunately, in the US, so Canada has pretty good adoption on that. They recognize that the OC, I think it's OCFI or something like that, initiative has to be complied with. Unfortunately, in the US, there's a movement, I think it's about 18 states that are fighting the Biden's administration of the ESG compliance to get your loan. So it's a hotly debated issue. I fully support it. I think that any business that is developing has to have regard to it. As regards the blockchain aspect of it, one of the things that I'm thinking about as I'm sitting here listening is, first of all, the brain power around this committee is incredible. I'm really learning a lot. But there's, like, do we form a DAO? Do we do that? Getting the token issued is pretty straightforward, but you got to get people to buy into it. Getting it traded is pretty straightforward. But I had a very interesting thing that I saw in Wyoming that I would share with this group. They may not know. Wyoming has now established, when you're forming a corporation in Wyoming, and it's a DAO, built right into the certificates of incorporation is a link to the smart contract and the blockchain. So I think that is really, really smart, because when you ask a lot of people on looking at the blockchain, because is it transparent? The answer is yes, but not many people know where to go find it. Where's the information that I go read on all this immutability and stuff? So I think like Daniel says, starting with education is really, really important. I think the merits of looking at establishing a unique DAO for these initiatives is not that difficult. We could issue tokens to everybody here, and we could build our constitution and start voting, right? And it wouldn't be that difficult to get it traded on the exchange if people say it has value. But those are my thoughts, Alexis.
Well, that's really interesting, Wade, and I would love to explore that DAO idea with you further. And I think that, kind of sparks a question for you, Martin, as you're dealing with these big institutions who are, I imagine, becoming extremely concerned about their ability to comply with all of these new regulatory and disclosure frameworks, as well as being very concerned about inadvertently greenwashing. Are they starting to look to blockchain as a potential technological solution? Do you find that their perspective on the technology is changing at all?
Yes, I do believe that their perspective is changing, and it's really the reality that's driving that change. They're losing coverages. Insurance companies are dropping big corporations off their directors and officers coverages because of the lack of transparency around ESG and the S of ESG as well, whether they be oil and gas or pharmaceuticals, banks, you name it. So this affects, small agricultural producer to the larger markets and larger investment grade companies that have to deal with it. We see it all the time with activist investors suing, members, board members, whether it's Exxon, Shell, and the insurance companies and financial markets are very concerned about that. So I echo what Wayne was saying. I mean, the brain power around this committee is quite astonishing, all those different perspectives. And I think that's how we're going to have to approach this issue, is collectively and collaboratively. And this is kind of new for a lot of these banks and insurance companies. They really have to look through things through a different lens. And they're going to have to start addressing these things. And they are. It's just going to be painful, but we don't have the benefit of time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just so much urgency in the environment right now. And I mean, this goes beyond, traditional finance, of course, and
Yes.
Goes into fields like energy, where, as you mentioned, ExxonMobil, who recently had a very activist climate investor appointed to its board. Like, these companies, especially in high emitting industries, are facing these tremendous changes that are happening very quickly. So that leads into a question for you, James, as someone who's worked with oil and gas industry data for I know significantly more than 20 years. Are you seeing these companies start to look to blockchain as a solution for compliance and for tracking emissions and other, potential sustainability initiatives?
Yeah, you just brought up Exxon. I think I'm going to bang the drums a bit. We won an award with Exxon and the Blockchain for Energy Consortia out of Houston, or a naming on the Forbes Blockchain 50 for 2023. But I will tell you that those projects that we worked with Exxon and ConocoPhillips and 10 super majors, I can tell you that all of them have been deprioritized, not to the state of non-being, but they've reprioritized ESG motion ahead of all of that. So we were working on joint venture ledgering and authorization for expenditure. Of course, we're a big royalty shop. We're working on royalties, but ESG has surpassed all of those in terms of a use case viable. The consortia itself is trying to lean into that from the educational perspective. I'm also seeing that blending that you're talking about. The walls between these types of companies are being eroded. Big oil and gas companies are turning into big renewables companies, right? Some of the largest renewables projects. And as a result, you take on multiple frameworks, you take on multiple proof points, you take on multiple data streams. So the motion locally is definitely interesting. And I think most importantly, a lot of the oil and gas companies kind of sat back and said, well, where are the regulators at? I'm not going to do any, I already do a bunch of compliance reporting. There's a whole bunch of objects. The Alberta Securities Commission is now actually involved in projects to take carbon accounting as a direct report from any public issuer. So we're starting to see the oil companies say, okay, it looks like the government is mobilizing now and looking for opportunities. And we've seen that with the engagement at, Clay and team has done a good job about engagement with a lot of industry ecosystem participants. And I think all of that is lensing into ESG now. Like I said, I started with Bitcoin years and years ago, started working with the Corda network in like 2016, 2017. We've done work with Cardano. I've owned a bunch of stuff, and all of the narrative around most of those platforms has turned into ESG narratives. And one of the most interesting and most telling is sort of what's your carbon invoice? There's been a lot of focus on carbon credits, but what's the carbon debit side look like? And of course, that conversation is raised a lot, but not really in the fulsomeness of what's your invoice. We talk about footprints and stuff, but one of the networks we're working with, R3 and the Corda network, is very focused on understanding not only their footprint, but how their technology fits in the footprints of some of the large banking networks that they work with, and some of the large. And we're working on a project called Corda Zero, where we're trying to understand, as we validate these assets, as we take a token from an issued carbon math through a credit to the offset transaction being ledgerized, well, what's the footprint of that? What's the actual footprint of applying the technology? So we're working on how we would actually calculate everybody's ends. If we make a report to the ASC as an observer on our network, what's the carbon cost of that report? What's the carbon cost of the AER getting a compliance report? Because that's the fulsomeness of the debit side that we need to understand. A lot of talk of credits, we need to talk about debits, because an offset is an actual marriage of those two things. It's a decimation. So we're seeing cross industry, we're seeing elimination of barriers between industry, and we're seeing intense focus around ESG as something that stretches over all of that. So yeah, I can report that blockchain adoption is up, and the concept of ESG use cases are a primary part.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm just curious, out of the group here, post all of the challenges that were experienced in the cryptocurrency markets over the course of 2022, has that caused a bit of a pivot more towards permission networks, enterprise solutions? Like, is it getting a little more focus now that some of the attention is off of crypto?
Well, I have a lot of opinions about that, but I feel like I've answered 3 questions. But I will say the fulsomeness of the solution is a public and a private problem. Public gives us transparency. It gives us global spanning ledgers that anybody can get a hold of, as long as Wayne says, they know where the keys to the kingdom live. That transparency is growing. Anybody who's on we did some carbon trades on a sequestration network, I think 18 months ago or a year and change ago. And that's out there. The math on that, the attestation of the executives, the compliance, the frameworks that we used is all in the public state because it's encoded on the Cardano blockchain. That's amazing. But all of these companies and issuers and emitters and reporters are not going to put all of their carbon math in the public sphere. But they're going to need to share that carbon math in their custody, in their supply chain, through their vendors, through their partners, through their collaborators. So there's a hybridization that's happening, which is some of these facts are private. Now, those private networks can still interact with the crown, can still interact with regulations, can still act with organizations and bodies. But the general drift is issue from that private state, issue public, expositions, public claims, public statements about what you're doing onto a public facing blockchain. And you have a technology mesh there that has been unmet in these markets to date. That it represents a series of actions that you can do in private, in a trusted state, but then issued into a public state for full transparency and accessibility. And I think it's those bridgings that are going to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I really hope that the value of public blockchains, isn't lost in the conversation and in the push to greater regulation, because there, as you mentioned, enormous benefits to public transparency and building that trust from being able to use public blockchain infrastructure. So we have a great question in the chat, and thank you so much for this. And it's on kind of the intersection between all of these new technologies like blockchain and legacy environmental charities and nonprofits. How can they work together? How can they collaborate? What are their respective roles? Maybe Demian, do you want to take a stab at this one?
Sure, I think I'd echo something James said again. So two shout outs to you, James, today. Is when we were at the ESG summit in New York in October, the keynote speaker was the head of the SEC. And it was the biggest takeaway was transparency is key. And just to be honest, that was actually the absolute keynote takeaway from the head of the SEC, which I just thought was kind of amusing, because then all the money managers came out after, and public perception drives capital investment. So whether we're doing this, the transparency based on the altruistic side of it, or we're doing it to drive capital investments into our corporations or into our economy, it's none of the credibility is just not going to hold up if you don't have the technology behind it to really prove out your transparency and everything.
Yeah, and conversely, I mean, many of these established charities might have very manually based processes, but have decades of expertise at navigating things like governance and standards, and have the right relationships with government and other stakeholders that, projects that are just emerging in, on decentralized platforms won't have. So there's got to be that collaboration. As James said, the biggest team sport the world has ever seen. And we've all got to find ways, I guess, to, collaborate and work together all the time, everywhere, all at once. So it's very intimidating, that statement, from the UN Secretary General. But I can't help, as I know many of you do as well, see all the different ways that blockchain as a foundational data technology can actually help facilitate the enormously complex relationships and, data management processes and automation that we need to realize these goals. I mean, because there's no contesting at this point that we're not in a very urgent and serious situation. So,
sorry, if I can add a bit to that, I think if we look at the role of what some of the not-for-profits can play, it is a little unfortunate, but in the news cycles, we know that fear sells. So it's very easy to talk about the decimation of the environment and all the negative, which we fully understand. It's been a call to action. It's got people thinking. What blockchain has the ability to do is start to prove that real change is possible. And I think it behooves us as a society to realize that if we don't start talking about some of the wins and some of the potential for helping, we have already depressed the living hell out of an entire generation. And there is going to come a point where there might almost be a sense of hopelessness. We can't do anything. Well, that's not true. There are projects that are working, and they are backed up by science and by math and by blockchain, and they're having real impact. We just need better marketing, right? Because it's easy to talk about the bad. We need to talk about the good to let people know that, it might be okay, and maybe we can turn this around.
Behavioral science 101, Dan, and that's a really good point. It's really, arming people's subconscious mind to say that there is hope, and we can prove that we're doing things using blockchain technology, and that together and taking a unified approach, we're driving forward and making progress happen.
Yes, very well said, 100%. And I think, an important point as well, and something that I think would merit, potentially a discussion on its own is if realistically we know that there are going to be some fairly major impacts from climate change, such as, disrupted supply chains, the need to manage potentially large-scale relocations, the need to optimize our food supply chains to prevent food insecurity, and all of these types of issues that we in likelihood will face at some point. Blockchain can also support the infrastructure that we need to ensure that we can manage through any problems that come, so we don't feel like we're simply doomed to experience these massive global issues without potential ways of navigating them. So I really appreciate that optimism from both you and Derek, Dan. Does anyone else have any points that they'd want to add just in our last few minutes around reasons why we should feel optimistic about our ability to deal with climate issues?
I think we all on the call would like to hear you respond to that question, Alexis.
Well, thank you so much, James. And I feel like I've been, kind of interjecting my views throughout the webinar. But I would really highlight a point that you mentioned, James, and some of the other panelists did as well, about automation, and that blockchain's ability to create this layer of trusted data allows you to build applications that can then automate how you use that data. Because a lot of the processes that are currently used for understanding emissions or validating carbon credits or distributing resources in cases of natural disasters, for a different example, are all extremely manual. They're error prone, they take a long time. And until we fix this fundamental issue of not having the right tools and the right infrastructure to scale our climate action, we're not, even with our best efforts, going to be able to have the impact that we need to. So I think that's one of the things that stands out to me as the most important. And I think that as we start to have more technology convergence and more integration of AI and IoT and blockchain, what we're going to enable is a world in which a lot of these processes happen without any human intervention, where they're governed by, things like device-to-device transactions. And you might have a building that measures its own carbon emissions and then autonomously purchases offsets every night and offsets itself. And I think that's a way, and an achievable way, that impact can scale. But we can't do that without trust. We can't do that without decentralized systems and decentralized monetization mechanisms. And we need this digital economy enabled by blockchain to be sort of like a layer that runs underneath our conventional economy, helping us achieve all of these sustainability goals in a way that is not going to take, millions of Excel spreadsheets and hours of workers' time. So I guess that's how I would finish off with my piece.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. And I don't know about all of you, but as we've been talking, I've just been thinking pretty much everything everyone said, that should be its own webinar. Oh, now we need a webinar on that. So we can drill down so much into all of these topics, which are all fascinating. And we're going to be announcing webinars on these specific topics, probably about once a month over the next year. So you can keep an eye on our activities and all the other really exciting things going on at the Canadian Blockchain Consortium at canadablockchain.ca. Where you'll be able to find a schedule with all the events going on in Canada's nationwide blockchain ecosystem. And again, I just want to mention that if you're here in Alberta, coming up on April 26th and 27th, we have the Alberta Technology Symposium, which is a fantastic cross-sector conference that looks at all kinds of different disruptive technology innovations happening here in Alberta, including blockchain, but also extending beyond that to quantum computing and AI and IoT and green energy. So I hope you'll check that out and maybe join us for that great 2-day event. So thank you everyone who joined us today. Really appreciate your questions and your time. I hope you'll reach out to us if you have any questions. You can reach us at info@canadablockchain.ca. And I really look forward to the next event and having you join us there as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great panelists.